Well, good afternoon. My name is President of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies, and it is a real pleasure for me to welcome all of you to this webinar, which is focused on the new coalition government in Germany. This is part of a series we've been doing at AICGS over the course of 2021, more than a dozen events focused on various aspects of the German election campaign, the negotiation of a coalition agreement, and now the German traffic light coalition, or Ampel coalition in German. Now is when the work actually starts, after painstaking negotiation of a coalition agreement, and the ambitions of the German government now to transform the German economy, to modernize and digitalize the society are all going to meet their test in Europe, internationally, and in Germany's important bilateral relationships. And I'm really pleased now to be able to hand over the floor to my colleague, Eric Langenbacher. He's the director of our Society, Culture, and Politics program, who will introduce our speakers and get us started. And thanks to everyone once again for being with us. Eric, please take it from here.
Thanks, Jeff. Before I briefly introduce our speakers today, I really want to thank everybody who has made this series possible. We've had dozens of speakers over the course of the last 12 months. We've explored every aspect that I could think of that was relevant to the really important 2021 Bundestag election. You know, it turned out to be a much more dramatic campaign and outcome than anybody had thought a year ago. So, you know, German politics isn't boring after all, even if some of the politicians might be considered that way. I also want to thank our formal sponsors for this program. Here at AICGS, it's the Harry and Helen Gray Culture and Politics program. I also really want to thank the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany here in Washington, D.C. for their very generous support. And this has really been a true partnership. All year, we've worked with the Aston Center for Europe at Aston University in Birmingham, UK, with the International Association for the Study of German Politics, as well as the BMW Center for German and European Studies at Georgetown University. I really want to thank, in particular, Ed Turner, the interim president of the International Association for the Study of German Politics and the director of the Aston Center of Europe, who's really been a great collaborator on this initiative. All right, but this is our last session, our last webinar called It's Done in so many different ways. And we're going to explore the 177-page document and everything that is involved with that for the next coalition government, as Jeff kind of mentioned. And we have three terrific speakers today. I'm going to very briefly introduce them, but you can find more detailed biographical information on our website. So first, we're going to hear from Sarah Schmid, who's the head of the Division for European Integration, Constitutional Affairs, and Social Participation at the Academy of Politics and Current Affairs at the Hans Seidel Foundation. Then we'll hear from Isabelle Hertner, who's a senior lecturer in politics of Britain in Europe and the director of the Center for German Transnational Relations at King's College in London. And then we'll hear from Heather Conley, who's currently the Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic, and the Director of Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, here in Washington, D.C., and who is the incoming President of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. So without further ado, I would like to hand the floor over to Sarah, who I think also has a few slides to ground her presentation. Sarah, the floor is yours.
So Jeff, Eric, and Liz, thanks for having me here today. I'm going to take a closer look at the coalition's internal dynamic, on what binds it together, but also on what might pull it possibly apart. And I'm going to start with a more general observation, and this is the fact that coalition building has become more complex in Germany due to decline of catch-all parties, for example, the Social Democrats. As you know, government by coalition is the rule in Germany, but there has never been a traffic light coalition before. And this figure shows you the distribution of parliamentary seats within the governing coalitions in Germany. And as you can see, there have been similar constellations on the federal level in the past. For example, in 1969, we had the so-called social liberal coalition. In 2005, there was a red-green coalition. But I think what you can really see at the first glance is that the balance of power has been shifting. In earlier coalitions in the past, the Social Democrats had a very strong majority. If you look at the 2021 figure, if you really look hard, you can see that if you add the Green and the Liberal seats, they have a slight majority over the Social Democrats. And of course, this signifies that the balance of power within the coalition has been shifting. And of course, rule and the influence of the smaller parties are possibly more pronounced than in the past. And this leads me to my second observation, that therefore coalition builders have to harmonize a wide range of often contradictory interests, because the bigger the coalition is, the more diverse the parties in it are, the more difficult it becomes to harmonize these interests. And this figure, unfortunately, it is in German, but I think it visualizes quite nicely where the political parties stand. The first axis relates to economic matters, and there you can see the Free Democrats, the liberals, right on top, because they traditionally favor a very market-based approach with as little state intervention as possible. And now you have to go to the left to find the Greens and the Social Democrats. They are more to the left. They prefer a stronger state intervention in economics. So we have a closer affinity here. This is quite natural because the Social Democrats have their roots in the working rights movement, in the trade unions, while the Green favor stronger state intervention because they believe that tackling climate change requires strong state regulation. So close affinity here, while the FDP is in another bracket. But we also have another axis relating to cultural matters. So these are the positions the parties take on issues such as reproductive right, transgender rights, same-sex marriage, assisted suicide, and so on. And here you can see that the FDP and the Greens, they are a rather progressive parties in this regard. Social Democrats also, but slightly less so, but still they are within the same bracket. To make matters even more complicated, we also have not only divisions within the coalition or different preferences, but also within the parties. And this is especially the case with the Social Democrats. They have their more moderate wing, exemplified by Chancellor Olaf Scholz, but they also have a left wing represented by politicians such as Saskia Esken, Kevin Kühnert, or indeed the youth movement of the party, the Jusos. And while Olaf Scholz had a really strong showing at the polls, he lost the leadership election within his party only 2 years ago. So there will be plenty of internal debates to watch out for in the next 3 years, who might also affect the coalition as a whole. And this leads me to my third observation. I believe that there are areas of strong alignment within this coalition, namely a shared commitment to progress and social liberalism. And here you can see the official title of the coalition agreement, which roughly translates to Daring to be Progressive, Coalition for Freedom, Social Justice, and Sustainability. And I think this is really interesting and insightful because you can see progress will be the broad umbrella under which all of these three very different parties will find their place, or are supposed to find their place. And you can see there are three values, and each of them is associated with one of the parties. So freedom relates to the liberals, to the FDP. Social justice traditionally has been seen as the trademark of the Social Democrats, and sustainability has been regarded as a unique selling point of the Greens, so to speak. But why this focus on progress? Personally, I think there are two reasons for this. Firstly, during the pandemic, Germany has been seen as lagging behind, especially in the area of digitalization. So there's a rather broad feeling in the population that especially the public administration, the education system, and also infrastructure are in need of a digital upgrade, if you will. And this is, in my view, going to be an area of broad agreement within the coalition and also one of the core priorities. But we also had a youth movement in Germany, Friday for Future. They were really strong in Germany, and they argued that also not enough progress has been made on tackling climate change. And this is also something the coalition identified as area where progress should be made. And of course, we have the whole field. I themed it social liberalism. There's also broad agreement within the coalition, and the coalition agreement proposes some rather progressive legislation on matters such as transgender rights or also reproductive rights. And I think there also will be little controversy around these. But there are also areas of potential disagreement. And personally, I think that money might be an issue. As you all know, fighting the pandemic has been highly expensive. There were hopes that the pandemic might be over this summer effectively with the incoming vaccine campaign. But unfortunately, this turned out not to be true. So there will still be some time where the pandemic will dominate the political agenda. At the same time, we have a coalition agreement that features some highly ambitious and also highly expensive projects like making the economy carbon neutral. And to add another complexity, there is one red line for the liberals, and this line is called tax hikes. So you can see where this is going. There will be debate on how to finance all of these projects in times of the pandemic. There will be a supplementary budget for 2022. But after that, it's going probably to be more complicated to finance the project. And this, of course, is a potential source of conflict. But also there's also the pandemic itself. While the liberals favor a more light footprint approach in dealing with the pandemic, the Greens and the Social Democrats have called for more restrictive measures in order to save lives. And this debate is far from over because there's an upcoming vote in Parliament on the question if the vaccine should become mandatory for everyone. So also another source of potential conflict, even if this vote is going to be a vote of conscience. And there are also two policy areas where the differences between the parties traditionally are rather great. The first one is migration. Migration has proven to be a really divisive issue in Germany since 2015. During this time, the Free Liberals have called for a more law and order strategy on dealing with illegal migration, while the Greens traditionally favor a softer approach with more humanitarian restrictions. And as the situation at the Belarusian-Polish border has shown, the EU is still highly vulnerable to this issue. So it's not unlikely that this issue might pop up in 1 to 3 or 4 years. And this is going to be a challenge for the coalition on how to deal with it. And the same applies for climate change. The coalition agreement managed to reconcile the more incentive-based approach the Free Liberals favor with the more regulatory approach the Greens call for. But of course, there's still public pressure, youth groups taking to the streets. And if in 1 or 2 years there is a perception that not enough has been done and further measures are needed, This will put plenty of pressure on the Greens, and this would also would signify a certain challenge for the coalition. So we have plenty known unknowns, and I'm looking forward to discussing them with you. And I think I'm going to pass over straight to Isabelle and her talk.
Thank you, Sarah. That was very enlightening. Isabelle, you're up next.
Yay, thank you so much. And thanks for having me here. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so you're just going to have to listen to me. And I was asked to say something about Scholz's cabinet. And the title of my presentation is Something Old, Something New, Lots of Colors, but No Blue. And I'm going to say in a minute what I mean by that. So after the elections, the results were announced, and critics were saying that, you know, a traffic light coalition would just be a marriage of convenience, because after all, the Greens and the Liberals wouldn't really come to an agreement. But Olaf Scholz, when he was handed over the chancellorship by Angela Merkel a few days ago, stressed that there is actually a great deal of consensus between Germany's democratic parties. So of course, you know, he doesn't want to include the AfD in that. But he said there's a great deal of consensus between the parties, and that this will be the case also in the future. And even by his critics, he's seen as someone who encourages consensus and who's a pragmatist and a deal maker. And that might be an important skill, because as Sarah has just mentioned, there are some important differences between those three parties, and managing those will take a lot of diplomatic skill. So I'm just going to briefly describe his new cabinet. And what do I mean by something old, something new, lots of colors, but no blue? I mean that there are some old, in the sense of experienced faces in his new cabinet, some new ones as well, and a few surprises. Lots of colors. Well, okay, it's a traffic light coalition. I know that's a bit lame, but no blue, in the sense that the Conservatives are now in opposition for the first time since 2005. And so the CDU and CSU, whose color is blue, is not a part of this colorful coalition. So who is who? There are 16 cabinet members and Olaf Scholz himself. And 7 of these are from the SPD, 5 from the Greens, and 4 from the FDP. And of course, to some extent, that reflects the election results and the share of votes and share of seats. But it is a bit more complex than that. And I think in every country this is complex, but in Germany perhaps a little bit more because of the federal state and the need to represent the regions as well. But I'm going to say a little bit more about the different factors that explain this complex makeup. So first of all, we look at the allocation of portfolios, and here what matters is the issue of issue ownership. That's a nerdy political science term for the expertise that a party has. What is it known for? What does it stand for? And so we look, for instance, at the SPD, and it's perhaps not surprising that the SPD has the Labor and Social Affairs Ministry. Of course, it's, the party's roots are in the labor movement, and the manifesto had a strong focus on social justice. And also housing belongs to that, because that was very much framed as an issue of social justice. Secondly, the Greens, of course, own the environment issue in Germany. And what is remarkable here is that Robert Habeck is now the Super Minister for Economic Affairs and Climate. And Germany has perhaps copied the example of the UK and the Netherlands, where such ministries have already been in place. I guess it's to ensure that the economy is also part of the market, and also to make it more high profile, which of course is necessary if you have if you consider the election results of the Green Party. But also the Greens have now the foreign ministry. Obviously, Annalena Baerbock follows in the footsteps of Joschka Fischer there, so this doesn't happen for the first time. There's a precedent there, but she is the first woman to have the job, and that is of course important to mention. Thirdly, the FDP is now in charge of finances, which is interesting, to put it mildly, especially when we look at the Social Democrats and the Greens and their priorities for the EU. But I guess the precedent more for the FDP would be that they also own the Justice and Consumer Affairs Ministry, because justice has often been in the hands of the FDP as a party that is concerned with civil rights. So it's a very traditionally owned issue for the FDP. Now let's look at geographic diversity. So Germany, of course, is a federal state like the US. Political parties are also federal institutions, and it does matter that politicians from the different länder are represented in government. Yet, as commentators have highlighted, the new government has a rather Northern German note to it. There isn't a single Bavarian in it. Now, perhaps that isn't surprising, given that Bavaria is ruled by the Conservatives, but still it is noteworthy that it's predominantly Northern German. So Scholz and his chief of staff are both from Hamburg, Robert Habeck, Schleswig-Holstein, Annalena Baerbock, Hubertus Heil, Lower Saxony. So, some of the most important jobs are done by Northern Germans. Then the issue of old and new. There are a few former cabinet members in this new government. So obviously Olaf Scholz himself, who was finance minister under Angela Merkel, but also 3 of his colleagues. Other politicians came from the Länder governments, such as, for instance, Robert Habeck. But an interesting case is that of Nancy Faeser, who is the new Minister of the Interior. And she used to be the SPD spokesperson for Interior Affairs in Hessen, in the state of Hessen. And there she gained a reputation for her very thorough and professional approach to the investigation of right-wing extremist crimes. So appointing her is a very political act, and can show Scholz's commitment to fighting right-wing extremism, which of course has been on the rise in Germany in recent years. And she's also taking a rather conservative ministry over, so that might be a challenge for her. But yeah, she is certainly very experienced. My final point, my heading is Staring More Progress. This is, of course, what Sarah has already mentioned, the title of the coalition contract. And here I'm looking into the gender balance and the ethnic minority representation of this government. Now, Scholz's cabinet is gender balanced, if one doesn't count Scholz himself. And he said a few days ago Germany's security will be in the hands of strong women. And there he referred to Nancy Faeser for the Interior and Christine Lambrecht for the Defense Ministry. I would also add Foreign Affairs, and that's, Annalena Baerbock. So that is progress in terms of female empowerment and taking over portfolios that are traditionally coded as masculine, in particular Interior, the Interior in Germany. But perhaps a more radical step would have been to have a female finance minister and a male minister for family affairs. That's always women doing the job. But perhaps we're seeing that in 4 years' time. Who knows? Finally, out of the 17 members of the cabinet, one has a migration background, as it is called in German, and that is Cem Özdemir, who has Turkish ancestry. And he was one of the first 2 members of parliament with a Turkish background in 1994, when he got elected first. So him being also the very first government minister with a migration background is, of course, an achievement. But I think more needs to be done. And the new Bundestag has a share of 11.3% of MPs with a migration background. So I guess the future will be more diverse. We just have to be a bit more patient. So yeah, thank you very much.
All right, great. And next we have Heather.
Well, Eric, thank you so much, and Jeff as well, for this kind invitation. It's always great to be part of the grand finale of a series. And Sarah and Isabelle have done such a comprehensive job of describing the complexities of this Ampel coalition. I'll just touch very briefly on foreign and security policy, and then we look forward to your questions. I think it's absolutely understandable of a 177-page document of a coalition treaty. You're going to have something in there for everyone on foreign and security policy. And clearly there were divisions within the coalition process about foreign and security policy. For me, it was striking that when there were real clear differences, I think particularly on Nord Stream 2, the coalition treaty was fairly silent. When there were difficult issues to hatch out, like the continuation of Germany's nuclear sharing, or that responsibility, you had a contradictory outcome in the coalition treaty. On the one hand, there was a reaffirmation that Germany will continue its nuclear sharing responsibility. But at the same time, that Germany would apply to be an observer to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And those two processes are incompatible. But that is, again, sort of how the contradiction of that policy worked out. For those of us who follow German policy related to China, there was, the strengthening of designating China as a systemic rival. Again, something as part of the three-part policy approach that the EU has established vis-a-vis China as a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. That sort of, again, underscores the evolution of German policymaking vis-a-vis China. But at the same time, Russia was not designated a threat. That language was not enhanced. And so I think, again, you sort of see both, progress, but continuity. Certainly the strong support of NATO is foundational to German security was of course welcome, as well as the decision to purchase armed drones. But again, there was a very specific point on that to protect German forces only. So again, you have to sort of swim through these complexities, and you saw certainly a clear message on the absolute supremacy of arms control for this government. So those are some of the highlights of security and foreign policy that certainly from a Washington perspective, we were watching closely. So what does this mean in practice? Because that treaty, that coalition treaty was something for all and designed for each of the three parties and particular things they were looking for. What does this look like in practice? And that's exactly sort of where we are at this important moment. My own sense is we're going to see continuity from the previous Grand Coalition. There isn't going to be a lot of substantive change to German foreign and security policy, but we're going to see these differences of these three parties appearing all the time. So it's going to be really confusing to analysts and scholars because we're going to hear a lot of dissonance. So I think we've already heard that first out in the first few days of this coalition, with absolutely Foreign Minister Baerbock speaking very strongly on Nord Stream 2 and hearing silence from Chancellor Scholz on that subject. Again, I think this speaks to the difficulties of this relationship. And so again, I think focusing very much where Isabelle left off on the structure of this cabinet, this is where we don't know but anticipate where will foreign and security policy be made in this German government. I would suggest, which is certainly happening here in Washington and other foreign capitals, I think that policy will be made in the Chancellery. It will not be necessarily made in the Foreign Office. And that's where I think some of those conflicts may be. We know Chancellor Scholz is a centrist. He is a consensus builder. But it's unclear to me if he's representing a more much left perspective from the SPD on foreign and security policy. And this is where the appointment of Christine Lambrecht as defense minister speaks to certainly that side of SPD, which is very, very ideologically left. And this is certainly, I think, where you're hearing the nuclear ban dimension of that as well. Or is this going to be a more centrist approach that Chancellor Scholz is going to take? Clearly, Ukraine is the first foreign and security policy test of this government. On Nord Stream 2, on enhancing defensive capabilities, particularly on NATO's eastern flank. And I think what we're seeing, particularly from the Chancellery, is a re-emphasis of sort of returning back to Ostpolitik, the deterrence and the dialogue, sort of bringing back Willy Brandt's famous tactics. And we just don't know if they're going to work in this particular scenario. So I think that's going to be a first test. And so far, again, we're hearing contradictory messages, we're hearing silence, we're hearing toughness, not sure where that policy will come out. I think the second test, and this is not necessarily foreign and security policy, but it's certainly very focused on European policy. The second test of this coalition will be efforts on behalf of the Italian government, the French government, to push forward on sort of permanence of funding, fiscal transfers, debt mutualization, as both Sarah and Isabelle noted. That's a real cleavage in this coalition. And we're already hearing from the Commission, Gentiloni and others saying, nope, that was not a one-stop effort because of the pandemic. This is going to be a continuation. We'll also see some stress related to the French EU presidency. The coalition treaty did speak of, again, strengthening strategic autonomy and the French concept of that, while at the same time, NATO is foundational. So those two tensions, we're going to live together, and those contradictions. So continuity, contradiction, I would say, as the second element, and a very important challenge for analysts to understand exactly where this government is going on foreign and security policy when the challenges are increasing, whether that's from Russia, from China, from the Iran nuclear agreement, which potentially we could see collapse here very shortly, the pandemic, as we mentioned, the resurge. So these are going to be incredible challenges to this new government. So with that, Eric, I'll turn it back over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much to you, Heather, and to all of our other speakers. So to our audience members, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A function, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. And I will read them off to our panelists. But actually, I have a question here from Jeff Rathke, which I will begin with. And it's a question specifically to Heather. How do you see the reaction of key international actors taking shape, especially where there are potential fault lines between the coalition parties? you expect to see that Russia will try to exploit those divisions? What should we respect? What should we expect in that regard? The same goes for China. And to what degree is that a vulnerability? Is there any respect in which Berlin could take advantage of the ideological diversity in the coalition to deal with international rivalries? That's a great question. Almost like, is there a division of labor within the coalition?
Well, this is what I think this is the question, and this is sort of gets back to me of who is making this foreign and security policy and what is the ideological motivation behind that. Certainly, we saw Russia, even during the election, putting a lot of focus and pressure on Annalena Baerbock, as she was, very tough on Nord Stream 2, very tough on Russia and China. There was already, we would call that certainly election interference and trying to use social media amplification regarding her candidacy. So we've already seen some of those divisions even before the election. So my sense is, again, this is speculation and a guessing game, that this is where Chancellor Scholz is going to have to make some very important decisions about big important policy issues, I think, early. To set the tone, because if he does not, if he remains silent as he has, and I want to begin by saying this government just was stood up. So as I said, unfortunately, the geostrategic nature of our times does not allow governments to form and get their briefs organized. It hits you straight out of the gate. He's not going to be able to remain silent because the longer he allows one view from the Foreign Office, potentially one view from the Defense Ministry, potentially on these issues. No one's going to know where this is. And so for allies and adversaries alike, they will focus on the place where the policy is to their liking. So I would suspect many in Washington will be supporting the foreign minister and her perspective, but her perspective may not win the policy argument. You will certainly have can only speak to Russia on this. Russia using its considerable economic and political leverage within Germany and within the Social Democratic Party to bear influence on what eventually the German government does decide to do. And so this again is the longer this is not clear, not just rhetorically, but with action, I think it becomes more confusing. I think the perspective will be that again, whether this is continuity, whether it's new policy, who's making it, what's the justification under it, and not a series of contradictions and silence. So as I said, this sounds more critical than it should be because this is such a new government. But I said that Russia's aggression towards Ukraine is really going to put this government in a very difficult spot, and it's going to have to be very clear about its policy parameters. And if not, it's going to be more difficult.
Thank you. We have a lot of more questions about foreign and security policy, but maybe to give Heather a bit of a break, we will switch gears for a sec because we also have some questions about the opposition, in particular the union. And I suppose these questions would go for Sarah as well as for Isabelle. So, Sarah, you talked a lot about various splits within parties, the governing parties in particular, but what about splits within the CDU and especially the CSU? And how do you think the CSU is going to evolve in the future? And then more generally, who do you think, I guess Isabelle and Sarah, we should be watching for in the CDU and CSU in terms of future leaders? Is it going to be Merz? And who do you think might profile themselves in foreign policy as well as domestic and social issues? Sarah, maybe we'll start with you.
Thanks a lot. These are great questions, and I'm going to answer them speaking on my personal capacity and not on the behalf of the Hans Seidel Foundation. So I think division and split, these kind of words tend to have a bit of more negative connotation. But for a catch-all party, they are a good thing, I'm going to argue. Because catch-all party, they try to appeal to a very broad electorate. And of course, this translates into many wings within the parties with rather conflicting often rather conflicting interests. So, for example, the union not only has a conservative wing, but also very strong liberal and also strong Christian wing. And if you watch all debate, for example, between fiscal hawks and members of the workers' wing of the party, which really could rather heated, yes. So I'm going to argue division are a good thing, and they in the past they always managed to cancel out the extremes, and so I think this will be the case this time around also. So I'm going to argue that that it will still be a middle of the road politic, but of course I think the issue of tackling climate change is something that is going to become more important also for the union, simply because it's one of the biggest threats we are currently facing on this planet. But the challenge will be to find, really meaningful, good answer on how to tackle it, and an answer that, reconciles being a successful industrial country, a successful competitor on the global stage, with becoming a neutral, carbon neutral economy. And this will be a great challenge. Who's going to be the next Angela Merkel? Well, this is a hard one, because if you ask the same people 20 years ago or 25 years ago, who will come after Kohl, I'm going to argue few people would have bet on Angela Merkel. So this is things are rather in flux right now. I think let me look at my calendar. In 4 days, we're going to have the results of the leadership a contest in the union. I think this is going to give us a certain general feeling on what the future of the party is going to be like. But still, I think there were 16 years or longer, even longer than 16 years, the party has been shaped by Angela Merkel. So there will be a certain time where things have to settle, where also young voices are coming to the forefront. So unfortunately, no precise prediction for me, but it's hard to say. I'm going to argue.
Isabelle, is there anything you would like to add?
I'm also not going to make a prediction because I'm terrible at it, absolutely terrible. But I completely agree with Sarah that debate is healthy, that any big party has to have debates. And, critics said that Angela Merkel with her consensus style shut down some of the debates that should have been had over the past years about policies. And perhaps now is the time to do that, and opposition is certainly the time to use for that, and find the new direction. So I don't see that as something negative. And perhaps also if the party takes a more conservative turn after Merkel, maybe this is also not unhealthy, as it will highlight more the differences between the parties. So having moved to the center, moving a little bit back to the left and to the right is perhaps not a bad thing for democracy and for a healthy party competition. That's what I would add.
All right, so I have a follow-up question for you, Isabelle, because I thought it was so fascinating the way that you talked about the diversity or the balance in the current cabinet. I actually didn't realize that there was no Bavarian in the cabinet, but I also did like a quick kind of calculation. There's only one person from Baden-Württemberg in the cabinet, which is Cem Özdemir. Only one person from Rheinland-Pfalz. There's 3 people from Hesse, 4 from North Rhine-Westphalia, 2 from Lower Saxony, 2 from Hamburg. It's also interesting that there are 2 Easterners. So Gawitz is from Brandenburg, and Steffi Lemke is from Sachsen-Anhalt. But that still seems like it's a relatively underrepresented region. So I'm just wondering, I mean, what do you think that this kind of regional balance or imbalance, what kind of impact is that going to have on politics? And then also you brought up gender balance. It's also been pointed out that despite 16 years of control under Angela Merkel, she never had a gender balanced cabinet. I guess they came close, but this is the first time, if you exclude Schultz, What do you think? I mean, and that was a great quote you shared from Scholz about how German security is in the hands of strong women. Do you think, what kind of impact do you think these different factors in the composition of the cabinet will have?
Thank you, Eric. Hard questions. Regional imbalance is not something all that new, because Angela Merkel's cabinet was also not terribly Southern German. And I mean, to some extent, of course, it is also beyond Scholz's control when you have two coalition partners and they then appoint their candidates for the different ministries. Then, you know, his influence is not as big as it would be if it was like a one-party government, of course. I don't know about the regional imbalance. It's interesting that, of course, the economic powerhouse of Germany is the South, and that is so underrepresented is, I mean, for Southern Germans, perhaps slightly disconcerting, disappointing the least. But because it's a federal state, they still have strong representation in the, of course, in the Bundestag and also in the Bundesrat. And as some could also point out, for the last 16 years, the CSU was always in government, right, and shared power and had really important ministry posts and was included in all key decisions. So this is just part of government turnover to some extent. The gender balance, I think symbolically, first of all, it really matters to have a gender balanced cabinet, and yeah, it's 2021, so it was really about time. For policies, that will also matter, and in this heavily gendered world in which we live, of course, it's still family and youth and women. That portfolio is still looked over by a female minister, as I mentioned, but there are certain priorities there. So stronger rights for children, also eradicating child poverty. That is something that Annalena Baerbock has really brought into the discussion, and stronger transgender rights, that which Sarah has mentioned. So I think those are policies that more the female candidates brought into the debate. So I think there will be an impact of this gender balanced government, to be sure. And I'm actually quite excited about that, given that Germany is such a conservative gender regime. So a bit of progress. Thanks.
All right, so maybe we can jump back into foreign and security policy, and we have lots of questions about that. But maybe we'll start with a bigger kind of structural question. And Heather, this will be for you, and of course, if our other panelists would like to weigh in. And that is, so who's going to ultimately decide on key issues like China, and if there will be a harder stance towards China? Transatlantic trade issues, which despite all the hopes in the Biden administration are not entirely resolved or anywhere near being resolved. Digital issues. I mean, Heather, I think that you mentioned that you think that ultimately the policy will come from the chancellery and the foreign minister or other relevant ministers will not be so powerful. But maybe you could talk a little bit, if there is a difference of opinion, if Baerbock is pushing for a harder stance on Nord Stream 2, for instance, who's going to decide in the end, and what kind of consequences would that kind of cleavage within the government have?
Well, I think, again, this is where there's continuity in government. In Chancellor Merkel's chancellery, she held those very powerful tools. She was the one who really personally led and took great pride in creating a robust Sino-German relationship. In fact, and did not want to see that investment not fully pay off, even as the geopolitics began to change quite dramatically. So again, this is more what we anticipate. We'll have to see what it is in action, but that power will remain with Chancellor Scholz. And this is where I think if the last few days are sort of a prelude to what's to come, I think this is going to be really challenging, because if the foreign minister wants to maintain a very strong and clear public message, and she wants to stay true to what she believes, and that continues to be in contradiction, as I said, right now the Chancellor is just not answering the question. So we sort of have that strong reverberation, but there's just, it's sort of left quiet. But when Chancellor Scholz does have to make decisions, whether that's vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine or China, and that's in contradiction with the foreign minister's views, that's a problem. That's a problem that coalition is going to have to address. And let me be very clear, I don't mean to point a finger as 4 fingers are pointing back. Washington is classically never on the same policy line and through the interagency. But at the end of the day, you have one policy, and that's made in the US system, of course, by President Biden. And this, I think we will see similarities. The question that, again, I'll come back to, I just don't know where the Chancellor is going to be on some of these issues. Will he follow his party, which has moved more, to Isabelle's point, to the ideological left? And I see strong sense that that's where the party is tending to pull on foreign and security policy. Will he follow that line? Will he carve out the balance between the Greens and FDP and that left SPD? And what does that compromise look like? As I said, if the coalition treaty is any example, we're just going to see a lot of contradiction. So everyone can point to something that they like, but the problem is it's a mishmash, and we're not sure exactly where the German government is going. So I think it's going to be a frustration to all as we watch this government begin to make some tough decisions on its foreign and security policy.
While we're on the topic, it's really interesting to me that, there's been so much attention devoted to, well, what's going to happen with the German-Russian relationship, or the German-Chinese relationship, or the transatlantic relationship. But, we also shouldn't forget that there are other kind of foreign policy hotspots that the new government's going to have to confront as well. There's one question about France and the Franco-German relationship, whether that will be reinvigorated, and what the heck's going to happen in the kind of French elections coming up in the new year. And then there's also a question about the Western Balkans, Bosnia and Herzegovina in particular, which could very well be unraveling right now. And do you think that this well, first of all, have Baerbock or Scholz spoken out on Bosnia in particular, Western Balkans more generally? And do you think that they would support strong measures to hold the country together? Heather, maybe we'll start again with you, and then if Isabelle and Sarah would like to weigh in.
These are fantastic questions. Thank you. I mean, clearly, this government, I think, will be much more in line with Paris. You had tensions in the last government where, again, President Macron wanted to go in that strategic, autonomous, truly a European sort of pillar. And there was great resistance, whether that was from then Defense Minister Kramp-Karrenbauer or others, and Chancellor Merkel always kept putting the brakes on that. You're not going to see that necessarily. I think there's going to be much more interaction and support of strategic autonomy. There's, again, those are 2 words that everyone has a different view of what that actually means. But again, this gets back to the point that we were talking about. What kind of opposition is the CDU going to present to this, and how much are their views going to shape? As I said, I think Germany is not in complete alignment, obviously, with Paris on a variety of issues that it wishes to see happen in integration, starting with fiscal transfers and fiscal unity, but also, again, a truly autonomous European identity that would work against NATO. I don't think that is where Berlin is, where this new coalition government is. So, but I think though, during the EU, the French presidency of the European Union, this is going to be put to the test because President Macron is using this presidency, understandably, as the opportunity that it is as a major election platform before the first round of elections. And, again, the difference that we see in the German election as we start embracing the French presidential election, where this was sort of a recalibration, a revitalization of the left and the center left in Germany. It's the exact opposite in France. This is nearly a complete political shift to the right, where you have now 3 candidates, which of course Eric Zemmour, and you have Marine Le Pen, and now Valérie Pécresse. This is all right, and Macron is going to run to the right to win this contest. So there is still going to be certainly those tensions, but I would argue we have to watch Italian politics right now a little more closely to see where Prime Minister Draghi decides, and if Italy goes to an early election, that actually may be more of a concern, quite frankly, than France. On Bosnia, we just heard Minister Baerbock say very clearly that she would like to see EU sanctions against Milorad Dodik. In Bosnia, the US has sanctioned Dodik for quite some time. The EU has not. Germany has always played a very historically strong role in policy making in the Western Balkans. That policy has been adrift for some time, as is the EU policy, as well as the US policy towards the Western Balkans. We are paying for that lack of inattention because other influences, whether that's Russia, China, Turkey, the Gulf countries. So there now is both a pretty dramatic situation where we really could see additional fragmentation in Bosnia, growing tensions between Serbia and Kosovo, and we just don't have the policy prioritization that is needed for this region. So we hope certainly that German policy turns more fully to dealing with the Western Balkans, but it's not going to be easy because we've allowed the situation to really slide to a point where we're trying to manage a situation that's starting to move out of our control.
Sarah or Isabelle, any remarks?
I think only to add a little point, because Heather's been making all of the important points, but coming back to the internal dynamics, we also heard calls from Paris to institutionalize the recovery fund. And I think this is going to be really interesting because the Greens are behind, they really support this goal. The more leftist part of the Social Democrats could also get behind this agenda. But especially the Seeheimer Kreis, the more conservative parts of the social democracy, but also the Free Liberals, there's going to be quite a bit of opposition. So I think the internal dynamics are far more interesting in the case than the public debates, and this is something to really watch out for in the next months.
All right, I think we have time for just one more question. So let's move back to a kind of domestic focus for a second. A question from Sven Siefken. He makes a very good point that there's party change in the leadership of many big and important ministries, like Interior, like the Foreign Office, like Finance. Do you think this is going to be a challenge for the new ministers and how they will manage? Presumably, there are quite a few career bureaucrats that were very comfortable with the old leadership. So maybe that's a question for Isabelle. Do you think that the changes in these key ministries will impact governance?
So living in the UK, I see that there are so many reshuffles. So there's a reshuffle every year in the UK, right? And so many ministers changed and shuffled around all the time, so that the idea is that you become sort of a manager of a ministry without ever having had the deep, long-standing expertise, and something that's actually how it should be. I'm not so sure. I think it is important to understand what you're dealing with and become an expert in a policy area. So I think it will take time, obviously, for the new ministers to understand their portfolio. And for those who've never been in government, including Annalena Baerbock and Christian Lindner, right, who've been members of parliament and party leaders and have given great speeches and all, but actually being in charge of a really powerful ministry is a new game. So I think they will have to prove themselves, first of all. But turnover is healthy and necessary in a democracy as well. So I think it's positive, and you know, it's not a complete turnover either, as several have been in Merkel's government before. So I think it's a good balance of experienced and new ministers overall. The question is just if they can, and this is what Heather already mentioned and Sarah as well, if they can find enough common ground and unity to have a strong message on the key issues. Thanks.
Well, with that remark, I see that we have come up to time. So I would like to thank our three speakers today for our final kind of webinar in this year-long series. So this was a terrific send-off, but it also reminded me that there will be many issues that we will need to return to in the new year. I'm thinking that we're going to have to do something on the CDU and the CSU probably right away in January to see what's going on. And I'm sure that we'll have foreign policy, I don't want to say crises, I would not wish that on anyone at this point in time, but foreign policy issues that we will also probably have to return to. So to all of our attendees, thank you for tuning in today and all year. And we hope to welcome you back for more analysis in the new year. Bye, everybody, and happy holidays.